I hated my daughter-in-law for 12 years, and if that phone had not vibrated on a rainy Thursday night, I probably would have carried that hatred with me for the rest of my life. My name is Margaret Walker. I am 71 years old, a widow, a mother, and a grandmother. I have lived long enough to know that life is rarely simple, yet for more than a decade I convinced myself that one thing was certain. Rachel Walker, the woman my son married, had destroyed my family. Looking back now, I wish I could tell you that our problems started with something dramatic. I wish there had been one terrible argument, one shocking betrayal, or one unforgettable moment that explained everything. The truth was far less obvious. Our dislike for each other grew slowly, like cracks spreading through the foundation of a house. At first, the signs were small. Rachel would make a comment that feels disrespectful. I would respond with silence that carries more judgment than words ever could. Family dinners became uncomfortable. Holidays felt tense. Every conversation seems to contain a hidden meaning. My son, Daniel, spent years trying to keep the peace. I often watched him move between us like a referee trapped inside a game he never wanted to play. The worst part was that neither Rachel nor I ever admitted how much we disliked each other. We smiled in photographs. We exchanged birthday gifts. We sat at the same Thanksgiving table. From the outside, everything looks normal. Inside, resentment grows year after year. I told myself I was protecting my son. Rachel probably told herself she was protecting her marriage. Somewhere along the way, those justifications became permanent. By the time my granddaughter Sophie was 10 years old, Rachel and I had perfected the art of avoiding another. Family gatherings followed predictable patterns. If she was in the kitchen, I stayed in the living room. If I arrived early, she arrived late. We communicate through Daniel whenever possible. It was exhausting, but after so many years, it felt normal. That is the dangerous thing about bitterness. If you live with it long enough, it begins to feel like part of your personality. Friends occasionally asked what had happened between us. I never had a clear answer. I would simply say that some people were not meant to get along. It sounded reasonable. It sounded mature. Deep down, it was also a convenient excuse. The truth was that I had stopped trying to understand her a long time ago. Then came the winter that changed everything. It began like any other year. Christmas came and went. Family photographs were taken. Polite conversations were exchanged. Rachel and I barely looked at each other. I remember standing beside the fireplace at Daniel's house, watching her laugh with guests from across the room. Even then, I felt the familiar irritation rising inside me. I thought I knew exactly who she was. I thought I understood every motive behind every action she had ever taken. I couldn't have been more wrong. 3 months later, on a cold Thursday evening, rain tapped against my apartment windows while I sat alone reading a novel. The clock showed a little after 10 o'clock when my phone suddenly rang. I almost ignored it. The number was unfamiliar. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. Within 60 seconds, everything I believed about Rachel Walker would begin to unravel. The voice on the other end of the line belongs to a woman named Karen. At first, I thought she had dialed the wrong number. She sounded nervous, almost hesitant, as though she had spent days gathering the courage to make the call. "Are you Margaret Walker?" she asked. "Yes." There was a brief pause before she continued. "I know this may sound strange, but I worked with your late sister-in-law, Linda, many years ago." The name immediately caught my attention. Linda had passed away nearly 3 years earlier. She had been married to my husband's brother and was one of the few people who knew both Rachel and me well. "I am listening," I said carefully. Karen took a deep breath. "There are some things I think you should know." What followed confused me more than it clarified anything. Karen explained that after Linda passed away, several boxes containing old documents, letters, and personal belongings had remained in storage. Recently, those items had been transferred to a family friend who was helping settle remaining affairs. While sorting through the boxes, Karen discovered something unexpected. There were letters. Not one or two. Dozens of them. Many were addressed to me. Others were addressed to Rachel. I frowned. What kind of letters? Personal letters, Karen replied. Some of them go back more than 10 years. My confusion deepened. Neither Rachel nor I exchanged letters. In fact, during most of those years, we barely exchanged greetings. Karen continued. There is something unusual about them. None of them appear to have been mailed. I sat upright in my chair. Rain continued tapping against the window beside me. Suddenly, the sound felt much louder. Why are you calling me? I asked. Because after reading some of them, I realized they involved both you and your daughter-in-law. And because I think they may explain a lot. My stomach tightened. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, Karen offered to bring the documents to me in person. We arranged to meet the following afternoon at a small cafe halfway between our homes. After ending the call, I sat motionless in my living room. Questions raced through my mind. Why would letters addressed to me be sitting in storage? Why had they never been mailed? And what did any of this have to do with Rachel? The next day, I arrived at the cafe 15 minutes early. Karen was already waiting at a corner table. She appeared to be in her 60s, with kind eyes and an expression that suggested she understood the weight of what she carried. Next to her sat a large envelope. After brief introductions, she carefully slid the envelope across the table. I think you should see these yourself. My hands felt strangely cold as I opened it. Inside were several handwritten letters. The first thing I noticed was the handwriting. It belongs to Rachel. I had immediately from birthday cards and holiday notes she had recognized written over the years. My heart began beating faster. I pulled out the top letter and looked at the date. 11 years earlier. Long before the worst years of our conflict. Slowly, I unfolded the pages. The first sentence stopped me completely. Dear Margaret, I know you probably do not want to hear from me, but I have been trying to find a way for us to understand each other. I stared at the words in disbelief. Rachel had written to me. Not once. Not twice. Many times. And somehow, I had never seen a single one of those letters. For a long time, I simply sat in that cafe staring at the pages in my hands. The world around me seemed to fade into the background. I could hear dishes clinking and quiet conversations from nearby tables, but my attention remained fixed on the letter Rachel had written more than a decade earlier. The words were polite, sincere, and painfully dangerous. She wrote about how difficult it had been joining our family. She admitted she often felt judgment and unwelcome. She explained that she wanted us to have a better relationship, not only for Daniel's sake but because she truly hoped we could become family. I turned to the second letter. Then the third. Each one revealed the same pattern. Rachel had reached out repeatedly. She had apologized for misunderstandings I barely remembered. She had asked to meet for coffee. She had suggested starting over. She had expressed concern whenever she sensed tension growing between us. Yet none of those letters had ever reached me. By the time I finished reading the first few, my emotions were completely tangled. Confusion mixed with disbelief. Disbelief mixed with regret. The version of Rachel I had carried in my mind for 12 years did not match the woman whose words filled those pages. Karen watched quietly from across the table. Finally, I looked up. Why would these letters never have been mailed? I asked. She sobbed. That is the question I hoped you could answer. I couldn't. Nothing about the situation makes sense. After leaving the cafe, I drove home with the envelope resting on the passenger seat beside me. That evening, I read every letter from beginning to end. Some were only a page long. Others stretched several pages. Together they formed a timeline of a relationship that never had the chance to exist. One letter particularly affected me. It had been written shortly after Sophie was born. Rachel described her fears about becoming a mother. She wrote that she wished she had someone experienced to ask for advice. She even admitted that she admired many of the ways I had raised Daniel. Reading those words felt almost surreal. During that period, I remembered believing Rachel wanted nothing to do with me. Yet here was written proof that she had once hoped for exactly the opposite. As midnight approached, I found myself opening old memories I had not examined in years. Small incidents returned to me. Conversations that ended strangely. Invitations that never seemed to arrive. Messages that apparently went unanswered. At the time, I had interpreted each event as another sign that Rachel disliked me. Now, for the first time, I wondered whether something else had been happening behind the scenes. The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. Before going to bed, I spread the letters across my dining table and studied the dates. They covered nearly 6 years. 6 years of attempts. 6 years of silence. 6 years during which Rachel believed I was ignoring her while I believed she did not care. The realization was heartbreaking. But an even larger question remains unanswered. If Rachel wrote all these letters and I never received them, where did they go? And who had made sure they stayed hidden for all those years? As I stood staring at the collection of envelopes beneath the soft light above my table, I realized this mystery was only beginning. Somewhere in the past, buried beneath years of resentment and misunderstanding, was a truth neither Rachel nor I had ever been allowed to see. The next morning, I woke up with the uneasy feeling that accompanies a question that refuses to leave your mind. The letters remained spread across my dining table exactly where I had left them. Sunlight streamed through the window and illuminated pages that had quietly waited more than a decade to be read. I poured myself a cup of coffee and began examining them again, this time paying closer attention to details I had missed the night before. Several envelopes contained dates. Some included notes about events I remember clearly. One referenced a family barbecue where Rachel thought she had offended me. Another mentioned a Christmas gathering where she believed I ignored a gift she had carefully chosen. Reading her perspective feels like looking into an alternate version of history. In every situation, she described trying to repair our relationship. In every situation, she assumed I had rejected her efforts. By lunchtime, one detail stood out above all the others. Nearly every letter mentioned Linda. Sometimes Rachel wrote that she had given the letter to Linda because she was planning to see me soon. Other times she thanked Linda for offering to pass along messages. I stared at those references for a long time. Linda had always positioned herself as a peacemaker within the family. Whenever tension surfaced, she was often the first person to volunteer her help. At least, that was what I believed. Yet here sat years of correspondence that somehow never reached its destination. That afternoon, I called Karen and asked if there was anything else in the storage boxes. She hesitated before answering. Actually, yes. There were a few journals. My pulse quickened. Journals? Mostly notes Linda kept over the years. I didn't read much because they seemed personal. But after finding the letters, I wondered whether they might be connected. We agreed to meet again the following day. That night, I barely slept. Old memories kept replaying in my head. Moments I had dismissed years ago suddenly seemed different. I reminded Rachel inviting me to lunch shortly after Sophie was born. The invitation had been cancelled at the last minute through Linda. I remembered Rachel supposedly declining my offer to help during a difficult period after Daniel changed jobs. Again, the message had come through Linda. One memory after another surfaced. Individually, they meant very little. Together, they formed a pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. The next afternoon, Karen arrived carrying another box. Inside were notebooks, calendars, and folders organized by year. We sat together at my dining table and carefully sorted through the contents. Most of it appears ordinary. Appointment reminders. Shopping lists. Family notes. Then Karen opened a folder tucked between two journals. Several folded pages slipped onto the table. One page immediately caught my attention because it contained my name. The handwriting belongs to Linda. My hands trembled slightly as I began reading. The note was not addressed to anyone. It appears to be a private reflection. At first, the content seemed harmless. Then I reached a sentence that made my stomach drop. Linda wrote that keeping Rachel and me apart had become easier than she expected because both of us were too proud to question what we were being told. I read the sentence twice. Then a third time. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Karen looked at me with concern. I slowly placed the page on the table. For 12 years, I believed Rachel was the source of our problems. At that moment, for the first time, I began to suspect that neither of us had ever been seeing the full truth. For several minutes, I could do nothing except stare at the page lying on my dining table. The sentence echoed in my mind again and again. Keeping Rachel and me apart had become easier than she expected because both of us were too proud to question what we were being told. Linda had written those words herself. Not like a joke. Not as a misunderstanding. As a private observation she never expected anyone else to read. Karen remained silent, allowing me time to process what I had discovered. My emotions shifted rapidly between disbelief, sadness, and confusion. Linda had been part of our family for nearly 30 years. I trusted her. Rachel trusted her. Everyone trusted her. The idea that she might have played a role in the hostility between Rachel and me felt almost impossible to accept. Yet the evidence was sitting directly in front of me. We continued examining the journals and notes throughout the afternoon. Most entries were ordinary, but every so often another troubling detail appeared. Several notes referenced conversations that had supposedly taken place between Rachel and me. In many cases, neither conversation had ever happened. One entry described Rachel trying to arrange a meeting with me. Another described Linda decided not to pass along the request because she believed the timing was not right. There were references to delayed messages, invitations withheld, and misunderstandings left unresolved. None of it seemed malicious in the traditional sense. Instead, it felt as though Linda had appointed herself the manager of our relationship and gradually convinced herself she knew what was best for everyone involved. The consequences, however, were devastating. Year after year, opportunities for reconciliation had quietly disappeared. By early evening, Karen left, promising to contact me if she discovered anything else. After she drove away, I sat alone at my dining table surrounded by documents that were forcing me to reconsider more than a decade of my life. I picked up one of Rachel's letters and read it again. This time, I focused on the date. It had been written shortly before a Thanksgiving gathering that ended in one of our worst family arguments. For years, I believed Rachel intentionally embarrassed me during that holiday. According to the letter, she had actually been trying to apologize previously. The apology never reached me. I closed my eyes and remembered that day. Rachel had seemed nervous. I had interpreted her behavior as insincerity. She likely interpreted my coldness as rejection. Neither of us understood what was really happening. Suddenly, dozens of painful memories looked different. What if many of our conflicts had followed the same pattern? What if we had spent 12 years reacting not to each other, but to distorted versions of each other created by missing information and false assumptions? The thought was almost unbearable. Around 9 o'clock that evening, I walked to the living room and looked at a framed family photograph taken years earlier. Daniel stood between Rachel and me, smiling for the camera. At the time, I believed he was the only innocent person trapped in our feud. Now I realized Rachel might have been trapped too. For the first time in 12 years, I felt something I never thought possible. Sympathy. Not completely trusting. Not immediate forgiveness. But sympathetic. The walls I had built around my resentment were beginning to crack. And with every new piece of evidence, one truth became harder to deny. Rachel and I had wasted years believing we were enemies. If that were true, then sooner or later I would have to make a choice. I could continue protecting the story I had believed for 12 years, or I could finally speak to the woman I had spent 12 years blaming. For the next 3 days, I carried my phone everywhere. It sat beside me during breakfast, rested on the table while I read, and remained within reach whenever I left the house. Several times I picked it up, opened Rachel's contact information, and then put it back down again. The idea of calling her feels simple in theory and impossible in practice. 12 years of resentment cannot be erased by a few letters and a handful of discoveries. Even if the evidence points toward a painful misunderstanding, there were still years of hurt standing among us. During that time, I continued reading through the documents Karen had found. The more information I uncovered, the more complicated my emotions became. One journal entry described Linda worries that Rachel and I will eventually become close. Another suggested she enjoyed being the trusted person caught between both sides. Reading those words saddened me more than they angered me. Linda was gone. There would be no confrontation. No explanation. No opportunity to ask why she made the choices she did. All that remained were the consequences. On the fourth morning, I received another call from Karen. She sounded relieved. "I found something else," she said. An hour later she emailed me a scanned copy of a folded note tucked inside one of the journals. It was written by Rachel and dated nearly 8 years earlier. In the note, Rachel thanks Linda for offering to deliver another letter to me. Then she wrote a sentence that stopped me cold. "I hope Margaret knows I never wanted us to become strangers." I read that line over and over again. Strangers. That was exactly what we had become. Not because we lived far apart. Not because we never saw each other. We participated in birthdays, graduations, holiday dinners, and family celebrations. Yet emotional, we were strangers. By late afternoon, I knew I could not postpone the inevitable any longer. I dialed Daniel's number. My son answered on the second ring. We exchanged small talk before I asked a question that immediately caught his attention. "How is Rachel doing?" A brief silence followed. "She is fine," he said carefully. "Why do you ask?" I looked out the window before answering. "I have been thinking about some things lately." Daniel sounded surprised. "That sounds serious." "Maybe it is." He hesitated. Then he said something that stayed with me. "Mom, I know you and Rachel have never gotten along, but I honestly stopped understanding why years ago." His words are surprising because they were true. Somewhere along the way, the original reasons had become buried beneath habit and assumption. Before ending the call, I asked whether Rachel still enjoyed the little coffee shop near the river where she used to meet friends. Daniel laughed softly. "She goes there all the time." After we hung up, I sat quietly for a long while. Outside, spring sunlight reflected off parked cars and neighboring windows. Life moved forward as it always had. Yet inside my apartment, everything felt different. For the first time in 12 years, I was no longer wondering whether Rachel had ever tried to reach me. I knew she had. The real question now was whether I had the courage to reach back. As evening approximately, I opened my phone, found Rachel's number, and typed a message I never imagined I would send. My finger hovered above the screen for several seconds before I finally pressed send. The message I sent was short. I rewrote it 6 times before finally pressing send. In the end, it contains only a few simple words. "Rachel, this is Margaret. I know this may be unexpected, but I would like to talk. If you are willing." After 12 years of distance, those 2 sentences felt heavier than any speech I had ever given. Once the message left my phone, there was nothing to do except wait. The next hour feels longer than the previous decade. I tried reading. I tried watching television. I even attempted a crossword puzzle. Nothing held my attention. My eyes kept returning to the phone resting on the table beside me. At 8:47 that evening, it finally vibrated. My heart immediately began racing. Rachel's reply was brief. "I am surprised to hear from you. But yes. I am willing to talk." I stared at the screen for several moments before reading the message again. There was no anger. No sarcasm. No accusation. Only cautious openness. We exchanged a few more messages and eventually agreed to meet 2 days later at the coffee shop near the river. Afterward, I sat quietly in my living room trying to process what had just happened. For years, I had imagined countless arguments with Rachel. I had rehearsed explanations, defenses, and accusations. Yet our first direct conversation in years is governed by simple kindness. It was almost unsettling. The next 2 days passed slowly. Every memory seemed sharper than usual. I found myself revisiting family gatherings from years ago and questioning assumptions I had never challenged before. At one point, I pulled out old photo albums. In picture after picture, I saw moments that now looked completely different. Rachel smiled nervously at her bridal shower. Rachel held Sophie as a newborn. Rachel stood beside me during birthdays and holidays. For years, I interpreted her expressions through the lens of resentment. Now I wonder how often I had been wrong. Friday afternoon arrived sooner than expected. I reached the coffee shop 20 minutes early. The familiar smell of roasted coffee beans filled the air. Customers chatted quietly around small tables while soft music played overhead. I chose a corner seat near the window and waited. At exactly 3 o'clock, the front door opened. Rachel stepped inside. For a brief moment, neither of us moved. It felt strange seeing her outside the usual setting of family events. She looked older than the woman I remembered from 12 years ago, but then again, so did I. Time had touched both of us. She approached the table slowly. "Hello, Margaret." "Hello, Rachel." We sat down. The first few minutes felt awkward. We discussed the weather, traffic, Sophie starting college next year. Ordinary topics that barely scratched the surface of why we were there. Finally, Rachel folded her hands and looked directly at me. "Why now?" she asked softly. The question was fair. Perhaps it was overdue. I took a deep breath before answering. Because I recently discovered something that changed the way I understand the past. Her expression immediately shifted. Curiosity mixed with caution. I reached into my bag and removed one of the letters. The same letter I had first read at the cafe. Without saying anything else, I placed it gently on the table between us. Rachel looked down at the familiar handwriting. Her eyes enhanced. Then she looked back at me. Neither of us speaks. In that silent moment, I realized we were both standing at the edge of a truth that had been waiting more than a decade to finally be heard. Rachel picked up the letter with trembling hands. I watched her eyes move across the page. At first she seemed confused. Then her expression changed. Surprise gave way to recognition. Recognition gave way to something deeper. By the time she reached the final paragraph, tears had gathered in her eyes. She carefully placed the letter back on the table and stared at it for several seconds before speaking. "I remember writing this." Her voice was barely above a whisper. I nodded. Neither of us seemed eager to break the fragile silence hanging between us. Finally Rachel looked at me. "Where did you find it?" I explained everything. Karen's phone call. The storage boxes. The letters. The journals. Linda's notes. As I spoke, Rachel listened without interrupting. Occasionally she changed down at the letter as if confirmed it was real. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and exhaled slowly. "I don't know what to say." For a moment, neither did I. Then Rachel surprised me. "I thought you hated me." The honesty of the statement landed harder than any accusation could have. I looked down at my coffee cup. "I thought you hated me too." Rachel gave a sad laugh. "I spent years trying to figure out what I did wrong." Hearing those words felt like someone opening a window inside a room that had been locked for years. She began telling me things I had never heard before. She described writing the letters after difficult family gatherings. She explained how often she had asked Linda for advice. According to Rachel, Linda always claimed she was trying to help. Whenever Rachel wanted to contact me directly, Linda encouraged patience. Whenever Rachel worried about tension, Linda assured her that I needed space. Over time, Rachel began believing that every attempt she made was being rejected. Eventually I stopped trying, she admitted. Not because I wanted to. Because I thought you had made your feelings clear. I felt a painful knot forming in my chest. The tragic part was that I had followed a nearly identical path. Whenever I reached out through Linda and received no response, I assumed Rachel did not care. Whenever invitations seemed to disappear or messages went unanswered, I interpreted them as evidence that she wanted distance. Year after year, both of us built an entire narrative around incomplete information. The more we talked, the more examples surfaced. A cancelled lunch. A missed birthday call. An invitation to Sophie's school event. A holiday gift that supposedly went unacknowledged. One by one, we discovered that many of the incidents fueling our resentment had been shaped by missing messages, altered explanations, or assumptions neither of us ever questioned. Nearly 2 hours passed before either of us noticed the time. The awkwardness that had filled the beginning of the meeting was slowly disappearing. In its place was something unexpected. Understanding. Not completely trusting. Not instant healing. But understanding. As sunlight faded beyond the cafe windows, Rachel looked at me with a mixture of sadness and relief. "Do you realize how much time we lost?" she asked softly. The question lingered between us. 12 years. 12 birthdays. 12 Christmas mornings. 12 years of family memories colored by a conflict neither of us fully understood. I felt tears threatening the surface, but I managed a small nod. For the first time in more than a decade, Rachel and I were not arguing about the past. We were uncovering it together. And deep inside, I sensed that the most important conversation was still ahead of us. When Rachel and I finally left the cafe that evening, neither of us seemed eager to say goodbye. We stood beside our cars beneath the fading light, both aware that something significant had changed. Yet we also understood that discovering the truth was only the beginning. The real challenge will be deciding what to do with it. Over the next several days, we spoke more than we had during the previous 12 years combined. At first, our conversations remained cautious. We exchanged messages about the letters, the journals, and memories that suddenly looked different through this new lens. Then the discussions gradually became more personal. One afternoon, Rachel called me while driving home from work. We ended up talking for nearly an hour. During that conversation, she shared something that stayed with me. "Do you know what hurts the most?" she asked. "It was not believing you disliked me. It was believing you disliked me without ever giving me a chance." Her honesty left me silent. Eventually I admitted something equally painful. I felt the same way. For years, both of us had been carrying nearly identical wounds while assuming the other person had caused them intentionally. The realization was heartbreaking. A week later, Rachel invited me to her house. Not for a holiday. Not for a birthday. Not because Daniel was there to act as a buffer. She invited me simply to talk. I almost declined out of habit. Then I remembered how many opportunities had already been lost. When I arrived that Saturday afternoon, Sophie opened the door. My granddaughter immediately wrapped her arms around me. "Grandma, Mom said you were staying for dinner." There was such natural happiness in her voice that I wondered how many years she had quietly wished for this. Inside the house, Rachel and I sat at the kitchen table while Sophie worked on a college application nearby. The conversation eventually returned to Linda. Neither of us wanted to speak harshly about someone who was no longer alive. At the same time, neither of us could ignore reality. After reviewing more of the journals and letters, a clearer picture had emerged. Linda had not acted out of hatred. Instead, she seemed to enjoy being needed. By positioning herself between people, she became the trusted messenger, the advisor, the person everyone relied upon. Over time, she began controlling information in ways she likely justified to herself as helpful. Unfortunately, the result was years of misunderstanding. I do not think she ever imagined this would happen, Rachel said quietly. I nodded. Neither did we. As the evening continued, we shared stories that should have been exchanged years earlier. We laughed at misunderstandings that once felt devastating. We compared memories and discovered how often our experiences had been completely different from what we assumed. For the first time, the past no longer feels like a battlefield. It felt like a puzzle we were finally solving together. Later that night, after I returned home, Daniel called. His voice sounded unusually emotional. Mom, he said softly, Rachel told me you came over today. I smiled. Yes, I did. There was a long pause before he spoke again. You have no idea how long I have hoped for this. Hearing those words made me realize something important. Rachel and I were not the only people affected by 12 years of conflict. The people we loved had carried the weight of it too. And now, perhaps for the first time, all of us were finally moving towards something better. As spring turned into summer, the conversations between Rachel and me became a normal part of life. We did not force friendship. We did not pretend 12 years of hurt had never happened. Instead, we chose something much more difficult. We chose honesty. There were still uncomfortable moments. Once in a while one of us will remember an old incident and realize how deeply it had hurt at the time. Those conversations were never easy, but they were necessary. One afternoon, Rachel invited me to help her sort through old family photographs before Sophie's graduation party. We spread dozens of albums across the dining room table. As we flipped through the pages, we found ourselves laughing at hairstyles, outdated clothing, and memories neither of us had thought about in years. Then Rachel paused on a particular photograph. It had been taken during Sophie's 5th birthday party. In the picture, Rachel stood at one end of the yard while I stood at the other. Even in a photograph, the distance between us was obvious. I remember that day, Rachel said quietly. I spent half the party trying to figure out whether you were upset with me. I stared at the image. I spent half the party wondering why you were avoiding me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then we both laughed. It wasn't because the memory was funny. It was because the absurdity had finally become visible. Two adults had spent years making assumptions instead of asking questions. Looking back, it seemed almost unbelievable. A few weeks later came Sophie's graduation. It was the first major family gathering since Rachel and I had begun rebuilding our relationship. I wondered how everyone would react. Daniel greeted me with a smile that looked lighter than any I had seen in years. Sophie practically glowed with excitement. Even relatives who knew nothing about the letters seemed to sense a change. During the celebration, Rachel and I spent much of the afternoon talking together. At one point, Daniel walked past our table, stopped, and stared at us in mock disbelief. Who are you two and what have you done with my family? He joked. The table erupted in laughter. It was a small moment, but it meant more than anyone realized. For years, family events had carried an invisible tension. People adjusted conversations. Chose seats carefully. Avoided certain topics. Now that tension was gone. Later that evening, after most guests had left, Rachel and I remained outside on the back patio watching the sunset. The air was warm and the yard still carried traces of the day's celebration. I keep thinking about all the years we lost, Rachel admitted. I nodded. I do too. She looked toward the fading sunlight. Do you ever get angry? The question surprised me. I considered it carefully before answering. Sometimes I feel sad. Sometimes I feel regret. But anger takes too much energy. Rachel smiled softly. That sounds like something I should have learned years ago. We sat quietly for a while. Then I said something I had been thinking about for weeks. The truth is that we cannot change what happened. We can only decide what happens next. Rachel turned toward me and nodded. There was no dramatic reconciliation. No perfect ending. Just two people finally seeing each other clearly after years of misunderstanding. And somehow, that feels more meaningful than anything else. For the first time in a very long time, the future no longer felt burdened by the past. It felt open. And that simple realization was beginning to change all of our lives. Several months passed, and what surprised me most was not how much Rachel and I had changed. It was how much easier life felt once we stopped carrying resentment everywhere we went. The tension that had quietly followed every holiday, birthday, and family gathering had disappeared. In its place was something unfamiliar but welcome. Peace. One Saturday morning, Daniel invited both of us to help organize boxes in the garage before a neighborhood charity sale. It was the kind of ordinary family activity that would have felt impossible a year earlier. Rachel and I spent hours sorting through old decorations, toys, and household items. Somewhere between dusty photo albums and forgotten holiday ornaments, we found ourselves talking as naturally as old friends. At one point, Sophie wandered into the garage carrying a stack of books. She stopped and looked at us with a grin. "You know, this still feels weird." Rachel laughed. "What feels weird?" "You two actually getting along." The three of us laughed together, but her comment stayed with me. For Sophie, most of her childhood memories include distance between her mother and grandmother. She had accepted it because children often accept whatever seems normal. Now she was witnessing something different. That realization filled me with both gratitude and sadness. Gratitude because things had changed. Sadness because they had not changed sooner. Later that afternoon, Rachel and I sat on the back porch drinking iced tea while Daniel finished working inside. The conversation drifted toward the future. Sophie will be leaving for college within a year. New chapters were approaching for everyone. At one point, Rachel became unusually quiet. After a moment, she looked at me and said something I never expected to hear. "There is something I need to apologize for." I immediately shook my head. "Rachel, we have already been through all of this." "Not completely." Her voice remains gentle but determined. "Even if I was working with incomplete information, I still chose over conversations. I should have tried harder." For several seconds, I didn't know how to respond. Then I smiled sadly. "If you owe me an apology, then I owe you one too." We sat there pressing a truth that had taken 12 years to reach. Neither of us had been perfect. Neither of us had been entirely innocent. The missing letters and manipulated messages explained much of the misunderstanding, but they did not explain everything. Pride had played a role. Fear had played a role. Assumptions had played a role. Healing became possible not because we found someone else to blame, but because we accepted responsibility for our own choices as well. As the sun slowly lowered in the sky, Rachel asked a question that caught me off guard. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if that phone call never came?" I looked out across the yard before answering. The image was easy to imagine. Another holiday season filled with polite distance. More years of misunderstanding. More opportunities lost. Perhaps we would have carried those misconceptions for the rest of our lives. "Yes," I admitted. "I think about it often." Rachel nodded. "So do I." For a while we simply sat together in comfortable silence. The kind of silence that only exists when nothing needs to be defended or explained. And as I looked at my daughter-in-law sitting beside me, I realized something remarkable. The woman I had spent 12 years believing was my enemy had become one of the people who understood this journey better than anyone else ever could. 1 year later, I found myself sitting beneath a large oak tree on the campus where Sophie was beginning her second year of college. Families moved across the grounds carrying boxes, laughing, and taking photographs. Rachel sat beside me on a wooden bench while Daniel helped Sophie unload supplies from the car. The scene felt ordinary, yet there was a time when I would have considered it impossible. As I watched my family moving through the warm afternoon sunlight, I thought about how close we had come to losing all of this. Not because of a tragedy. Not because of distance. Because of assumptions. A phone call had uncovered the truth, but the truth alone had not changed our lives. What changed our lives was the decision to listen. The decision to ask questions instead of protecting old stories. The decision to see one another as human beings rather than enemies. Rachel followed my gaze towards Sophie and smiled. She is excited. She should be, I replied. She has worked hard for this. Rachel nodded. Then she looked at me with an expression that had become familiar over the past year. It was an expression of trust. Not the fragile trust of someone testing uncertain ground. Real trust. Earned trust. The kind that grows slowly and quietly over time. I am glad you answered that phone, she said. Her words carry more meaning than anyone else nearby could understand. I smiled. So am I. Later that evening, after helping Sophie settle into her apartment, the family gathered for dinner at a small restaurant near campus. We shared stories, laughed about old memories, and planned future visits. At one point, Daniel raised his glass and looked around the table. This is my favorite family picture, he said. There was no camera. No photograph being taken. He simply meant the moment itself. Looking around the table, I understood exactly what he meant. There were no invisible walls separating people. No careful seating arrangements. No strained conversations. Just family. Real family. When dinner ended and everyone began saying their goodbyes, Sophie hugged me tightly. I love you, Grandma. I love you too. Then she hugged Rachel and Daniel before heading back toward her building. Rachel and I stood together watching her disappear through the entrance. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, she laughed softly. Can you believe where we started? I shook my head. Not anymore. As we walked toward the parking lot, I realized something important. The greatest loss had not been the 12 years we spent misunderstanding each other. The greatest loss would have been allowing those years to define the rest of our lives. Luckily, that didn't happen. We cannot recover the time we lost, but we can decide how to spend the time we still had. And that makes all the difference. People sometimes ask whether Rachel and I became best friends. The answer is simpler than that. We became family. Not because everything was perfect. Not because every wound disappeared overnight. We became family because we finally chose understanding over pride, conversation over assumption, and grace over resentment. Looking back now, I no longer think about the years we hated each other. I think about the day everything changed. And every time my phone rings, I remember that one unexpected call that gave us a second chance neither of us knew we needed.